if you have any problems hearing me, let me know. I'm glad to speak louder. So, I'm a little short for this podium, but I'm going to use it anyway. I never think of people 5'2" and under when they build these things. Maybe I need a little box. No, that's okay. So I'll get started. I'm going to start with a confession. Well, first of all, to make sure everybody's at the right talk, Old Bay and Oy Vey, the origin story of a classic Maryland seasoning. So I'm going to start with a confession. And the confession is that I am from Chicago. And not only that, but I have never had a steamed crab until I was over 40. And even worse, the first few times I went to a crab feast, I couldn't help but think, wait a minute, this is crazy. This is way too much trouble for such a small result in terms of the amount of food you get. Okay, so that's my confession. If you all want to leave now, feel free. But gradually I realized that the steamed crab feast is much more than a meal. It's a celebration of family and friends, of local culture, the culture of the Chesapeake Bay, and community. Because what could be more opposite of our homogenized American fast food culture of convenience than to literally have to knock your food over the head and spend a really long time digging out each morsel. And it's so messy that you can't look at your cell phone while you're doing it. So now I'm a big fan of the crab feast, and I appreciate it very much. Not to mention that I actually love the taste of steamed crabs, and I love the Old Bay seasoning that they generally come drenched in. So still you may be wondering, what makes me qualified to give a talk about Old Bay after all that? In addition, I'm not a food writer or a food historian. I'm not even a very good cook. But what I am is I'm a historian of American Jewish history, and Maryland Jewish history in particular. And that makes me uniquely qualified to speak on this topic. So that might seem strange to some of you too, because what does Jewish history have to do with Old Bay? So when I first became familiar with its importance in Maryland cuisine, I assumed that its origins must go back to early Maryland history. And I was as surprised as anyone to find out that that is not the case. So Old Bay is actually the invention of this man, Gustav Brunn. He was a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany who had lived in America only around 3 years when he came up with the recipe that put his company on the map. So Brunn was born in a small town in Bastheim, Germany, the southeast part in Bavaria, in 1893. His father, Abraham, was a small farmer and a small, not very successful cattle dealer. So Brunn had to quit school at age 13 to go to work, and he eventually found his way into the spice business. In the 1920s, he started his own small spice-making company. Most of his customers were sausage makers, and he became reasonably successful. But in 1933, Hitler came to power in Germany, and things started to get bad for the Jews who lived there. With the spread of anti-Semitism, Brunn started to lose customers. And meanwhile, Jews became subject to all kinds of laws restricting where they could go and what they could do. And this is like a 10-year period leading up to World War II when Hitler would start to take more drastic actions. But for a while, it was just a gradual restriction and things happening and limitations put on people. And then in 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of their German citizenship. And that's when Brunn and his wife Bianca started to try to figure out how to get out of Germany. And there they are, Gustav and Bianca Brunn. But it wasn't so easy to get out of Germany. In fact, Germany was fine with letting people leave, but most countries at that time had very restrictive immigration laws, and this included the United States. Millions of European immigrants had arrived earlier in the century, including around 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe. But there was a big backlash against these immigrants who were seen as dirty, lazy criminals, etc. And people were sure that these foreigners, and especially Italians and Russian Jews, who were considered the worst, people were convinced they would never assimilate into mainstream America. So in the early 1920s, Congress passed laws that made it much more difficult to come to America, but not impossible. And it turned out that Gustav Brunn had an uncle he'd never met who had settled in Baltimore during the earlier period before the restrictions. So he contacted this man who he didn't know, and the man agreed to sponsor him and his family to come to America. So then they started the very slow process of trying to get approved for a visa. And finally they got approval and were scheduled to leave in December of 1938. But on November 9th of 1938, about a month before their scheduled departure, there was a wave of riots across Germany known as Kristallnacht, sponsored by the Nazi regime. And it's one of the more famous episodes in the lead up to World War II. As part of this event, thousands of Jewish men were rounded up and put into concentration camps, and Gustav Brunn was one of them. He actually spent 16 days in the Buchenwald concentration camp while his family desperately tried to get him out. Fortunately, after paying a hefty fee, he was released, although with a shaved head and pneumonia. And only 2 weeks after this traumatic experience, the Brunns and their 2 children boarded a ship for the US. So he basically escaped Germany just in time. Now, when Jews left Nazi Germany, they weren't allowed to take any money, just a few marks, hardly anything. The rest of their money, if they had any, was confiscated by the Nazis. But they were allowed to take whatever possessions they had. And Brunn chose to take this, his spice mill. And this, it's a small spice mill that he used in his business. Of course, at that time, he had no idea of starting his own business right away. He needed to get settled, learn the language, figure out the lay of the land. And he arrived in Baltimore at the end of 1938 or beginning of 1939, right at the beginning of the year. And meanwhile, as Jews fleeing Nazi Germany had started to trickle into American cities, including Baltimore, the Baltimore Jewish community formed organizations to help them settle in. And the Brunns were able to get an apartment. Bianca, his wife, found work cooking breakfast for an elderly woman. Their daughter, Lori, who was about 20 at the time, found a job as a masseuse. And their son, Ralph, was in high school, but he took on odd jobs as well. Brunn was the one who had a hard time finding employment. It was still the Depression, after all, just at the end of it, and he didn't speak the language. But he managed to get a job at McCormick, not surprisingly, the spice company. But he only had the job for less than a week, and according to family legend, he was fired when his manager found out that he was Jewish. But Gustav Brunn really was an entrepreneur at heart. The people he had met in the Jewish community encouraged him to start his own spice business. So, using this small mill, which, by the way, is on display at the Baltimore Museum of Industry, he started the Baltimore Spice Company in late 1939. So, even though he had only planned to really sort of not immediately start a business, hardly speaking English and all that, he ended up starting a business almost within a year. He rented a small space on the second floor of a building across the street from Baltimore's wholesale fish market near the harbor. And this would prove to be, to change his fate. He wasn't intending, he didn't move to the fish market because he wanted to be near a fish market, but that was a space he could afford on the second floor, as you can see above the Southern Seafood Company. And it was the Baltimore Spice Company. So at first, he didn't pay much attention to the fish market, aside from the strong odor, the fish odor that emanated from the place, which he and his son both noticed immediately. His first order for his business actually came from Harry Atman. I don't know if many of you are familiar with Baltimore, but Atman's Deli is a long-time, well-known Jewish deli. And he also catered to some other Jewish food purveyors. He could speak to them in Yiddish because his English still wasn't good. But Baltimore also had a large non-Jewish German population. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but Baltimore had a very massive influx of Germans in the 19th century, and still was a very strong German, mostly German Catholic town. So somewhat ironically, he was able to build his business serving the same kinds of customers he had back home, German sausage makers and meat packers. Of course, they spoke the same language. He could speak to them in German, and he already understood their food traditions. So the business began to grow, with his wife Bianca keeping the books and occasionally operating the mill until the couple could hire another worker. But even while he was focusing on his German customers, the fish and the seafood sellers at the fish market across the street began coming to him to buy spices. And in those days, the sellers, the wholesale market fish people, made their own spice blends. They just came to Brunn's in order to buy the raw ingredients. But he noticed the kind of spices that they were buying, and he started to think that he could make a better spice blend than they were making. So although he based his spice blend on the same ingredients they used, he did some experimenting and tweaking until he felt that he actually had a better product. Also, in those days, spice makers had to declare every single ingredient on their labels. They couldn't leave anything off. So to keep anyone from copying his recipe, he added minuscule amounts of certain flavors to throw off anyone who might be tempted to try and copy. So you can see, this is a tin of Old Bay from 1950, you know, several years later, but you can see the ingredients: celery salt, pepper, mustard, pimento, cloves, laurel leaves, mace, and my favorite, monosodium glutamate. So according to his son Ralph, when he threw in these spices to throw people off the track, and this is a quote from Ralph, to his amazement, those minor things he put in there, the most unlikely things, including nutmeg and cloves and all kinds of stuff that had nothing to do with crabs at all, gave a background bouquet that he couldn't have anticipated. So in Ralph Brunn's estimation, Old Bay was almost an accident. And he tried to get the seafood people to use his spice blend, but at first they were reluctant because everybody insisted that their own spice blend was the best. So finally he approached a small crab steamer around the corner and gave him a 5-pound box for free to try and see what would happen. And apparently, as Gustav Brunn later told an interviewer, this man's business increased so much, so I started to get one customer after another. So Brunn called his concoction delicious brand shrimp and crab seasoning. And it was a friend from the Jewish community who worked in advertising who suggested something a little catchier. And that they used the name of a beloved local steamship line, the Old Bay line, and called it Old Bay. And his son Ralph, who was still in high school, developed the packaging for Old Bay. And the product quickly took off, and by 1942, the Baltimore Spice Company began selling Old Bay in grocery stores. So this was only 3 years really, well, just 3 years after he started his business. And it would end up actually being the only Baltimore, the company's only product for the retail market. So I just thought you might find it interesting to see the back of the 1950 Old Bay and maybe compare it to what they have today with the recipes. I don't know if anybody has any comments, but some of it seems, you know, remarkably the same, I guess. They had, you know, the crab cakes with mayo, Worcestershire sauce, parsley, baking powder, and 1 egg, and bread. Hamburger patties, steamed crabs, of course. Does anybody have any comments on this? I'm sure some of you are
pretty straightforward.
Experienced. Yeah.
Pretty straightforward on the hamburger.
On the hamburger, let's see. 1 pound of 1 hamburger. Right. Of course, fry or boil as usual. Of course, they don't have Old Bay ice cream on here like they have nowadays. You know, I think the market for Old Bay has expanded since then, but Old Bay French fries for sure, yeah. And he has a tomato juice cocktail, which probably is a predecessor of the infamous Old Bay Bloody Mary, which someone just told me about an hour ago that they thought people put too much Old Bay in the Bloody Mary surroundings. I'm not saying it, it's other people. So that's 1950, 8 years after he started selling Old Bay. So, you know, the product quickly took off, but despite its fame, sales of Old Bay actually made up a small percentage of the Baltimore Spice Company's business. It grew by selling seasonings to the food industry, with clients ranging from local brands like Utz and Purdue to giant corporations like Nestle. So I just thought I'd show you a little bit about what else the Baltimore Spice Company did. And these are ads for marketing to the food industry. And the company grew and grew and opened factories across the globe, including one in the Baltimore area. And as they grew, they moved into larger quarters. So from that little place, they were here, and then I think there was one more move after that. And here are Gustav and Ralph in Owings Mills in 1974. By that time, Ralph was very much involved in the company, and he eventually took it over from his father. And Ralph is still around today. He's up in his upper 90s, and he's written quite a lot about Old Bay and his family's experience, and he has a memoir about it. And he was always they were always kind of amused by, since Old Bay was really just a small part of their business, amused by the impact that it had, and always loved seeing how people were using Old Bay in different ways, and really got a kick out of it. So by the 1980s, the company had sales of around $40 million per year, and had like I was saying, had 4 plants around the country, and Ralph was the president. And finally, in 1986, they sold the company to a New York-based conglomerate. At a time, Brunn was 92 years old at that point. And he, actually that SCM, believe it or not, stands for Smith Corona, which owned Durkee Foods. But you could see Old Bay kind of passing from a local, something very local, to something more international. And
the typewriter company?
yeah, it's a typewriter company. Yeah, people probably, actually younger people here probably don't even know what Smith Corona was, because the company itself went bankrupt, but it was a typewriter company, and for some reason owned Durkee Foods, and they were going to put Old Bay in with this Durkee Foods. But then in 1990, Old Bay came full circle and came back to Baltimore when it was sold to McCormick, which was a little bit of an irony considering the Brunn family's history with the company. But you know, I think on the whole they were very glad to have it back based in Maryland again. So here we are today. And I think the fact that the label really, I put the other label on so you could compare the two of them. The fact that the label has been essentially unchanged for 80 years says something about the iconic nature of Old Bay, not just in Maryland, but around the country. Now, I said earlier that I didn't have steamed crabs until I was past 40 years old, but my mother did have a tin of Old Bay in our pantry when I was growing up in a Chicago suburb. She used it on fish, and I don't remember what all else, but you know, it was a common seasoning around the country. And I do remember the flavor, and there seemed to be something a little special about Old Bay, even from 700 miles away. But although I can recall the Old Bay of my childhood in Chicago, after I moved here to Maryland, it took on a much greater significance. It was something people didn't just have in their pantry, but actually talked about. You know, you wouldn't have somebody in Chicago getting up and telling people about the history of Old Bay. And of course, there are those steamed crabs, so Old Bay it became something much more important. So I was thinking about this and thinking, you know, what does it say when a foreigner can come from another place, not even speaking the language, and within 3 years of his arrival, invent a flavor that becomes a part of the very identity of a very local and distinctive region? I think it might show that local culture is not only something that's based on following the traditions of our ancestors, but something that becomes part of the very air that we breathe, ready to be shared with others and even shaped by others. Gustav Brunn built on a tradition that he discovered in Baltimore's fish market, and somehow he captured its essence and even took it to another level. And so now Old Bay is an essential part of that tradition, something that we rely on to always be there and to remind us of who we are. And to me, I don't know about to you, but Old Bay tastes the same way that I remember it tasting when I was a kid. It's interesting, though, when you compare the labels between the two. Now, today they don't have to list all the spices. So you see it says like spices, including red pepper and black pepper, and they're leaving out, who knows what they're leaving out. They're allowed to leave it out, so it's more of a secret recipe right now. But today's recipe leaves off only one ingredient that is in the 1950 version, and that's the monosodium glutamate. And I guess for that we can all be thankful. So that's in my prepared remarks, and I would be glad to answer questions. And I know we also have cans of Old Bay, jars of Old Bay that are for people to take back with them. They're up here on the table, so you know, don't all
So I won't put,
Sure.
maybe it's obvious, but when it went back to McCormick finally, the family had no part of that.
Right,
decision,
because
right?
they had sold it in 1986,
Right.
and then to that Smith Corona, the typewriter people. And then that company, I believe, went bankrupt, and Old Bay was sold again to some other company. And that company sold it to McCormick. So Old Bay had, you know, been kicking around for a while, and probably we are fortunate that it ended up, you know, back with McCormick.
Very
And I'm sure McCormick was very, you know, for them it was a, you know, a great situation, I would think, to be still anchored in this region and to have the main product of the region finally in their keeping. So, yeah.
Yeah, my mother-in-law, she always said that she always liked McCormick seafood seasoning as opposed to Old Bay. I guess back then, were they competitors or?
That's a good question. Yeah, they must have been. But I don't know if McCormick had its own, you know, did it have its own Chesapeake Bay seasoning?
It did, yeah.
Did it?
I remember.
Oh, what was it like?
But well, it was very similar, but Old Bay had that little zing at the end.
Yeah.
I like the Old Bay better than the McCormick.
McCormick called. Yeah.
Yeah, do you know what it was called?
Seafood seasoning. Yeah.
Seafood seasoning.
Do you know if Old Bay still sells in tins or is it only plastic now? Because I've noticed a lot more plastic.
Yeah, I think it's just plastic tin. I mean, I have what looks like a tin, but it's really, it's plastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it manufactured in Maryland still?
I think it's not, but
Don't
you know,
tell me China.
don't quote me on that. Yeah. I mean, do people? I was interested in knowing if other people feel the same way I do. That it does taste the same as like decades ago.
Oh, yeah.
So the recipe is, you know,
But they must have done a good job if they had the MSG and
Yeah,
the
right.
same taste.
Yeah, the MSG would have added part of that zing.
Right.
And I remember when I was a kid too, my grandmother had accent. Do you remember? People remember that? Which,
Yeah.
that's all that was. So fortunately, they managed to make an Old Bay that still tastes good without it. So, since it's not very good for you. Yeah.
I like that you're wearing a red shirt. I was just wondering, are your pants yellow?
No, I do have some yellow on my skirt, but I did try to make the backgrounds of the slides in sort of Old Bay colors, so you get the blue and the yellow.